Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Malaria Dialogues taking place ahead of the Malaria World Congress in Melbourne in the first week of July 2018. Today, we're going to be talking about leadership, in particular leadership at the regional level, and whether or not it's our leaders and heads of state that are really setting the goals for malaria elimination. We're lucky enough to be joined by Dr Ben Rolfe, who is the CEO of the Asia Pacific Leaders Malaria Alliance, or APLMA, based out of Singapore. And we spoke to Ben just ahead of the conference in Melbourne. So we're starting with a question about the theme, leadership driving goals. Are leadership, are the leaders the ones who are driving malaria goals these days? Is that what we saw at the recent malaria summit, for example?
I think we are seeing unprecedented leadership from heads of government around the world, which is fantastic. But I also think more broadly, the kind of leadership or the process by which heads of government and very senior leadership get behind agendas is often a bit misunderstood. You'll remember that very famous quote from FDR to Philip Randolph on the civil rights agenda saying, "I want to do it, now make me do it." And you may have seen global citizens say the same about Minister Bishop, the Australian Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop's support to polio. I want to do it, now make me do it. And I think a lot of these agendas are an alliance between the academics, civil society, the bureaucrats who are trying to encourage strategic policy making across government, and the leaders who, of course, want to drive novel initiatives, be recognized for their leadership, and achieve impact and results within a relatively short time frame. So I think what we are seeing is extraordinary leadership by heads of government. But behind that, there is also leadership at a whole range of different levels that I think is actually coming together with unprecedented coordination and synergy. And I think that is the really good news story, as well as the headline grabbing Bill Gates, Julie Bishop, End Malaria Council leadership that we're seeing. We are also seeing very supportive technical bureaucrats from the major bilateral development agencies, from the regional development banks, very importantly, from civil society and academia, plus, of course, organizations like the African Leaders Malaria Alliance and the Asia Pacific Leaders Malaria Alliance also have their role to play in increasingly coordinating this effort. Also, the refreshed Rollback Malaria Partnership. So, I think we are in a really good place. Certainly the community is stronger than I have seen it any time in the last 10 years.
Mm-hmm. It's a bit different, isn't it? Because if the goals are set at the top, it's different to what we've seen before, where you've had kind of goals set globally and then advocates or activists kind of hold leaders to account saying, keep the promise, keep the promise. I think what you're saying is that's still an element of that there. But if goals are set at the top by heads of state, for example, is it possible that there's a gap then between those goals and the capacity to deliver in country?
Yeah, I mean, that is a real risk. And I think, there's a malaria exceptionalism here. Malaria is a disease of the rural poor, particularly in Asia Pacific. And therefore, it's largely an invisible disease. If you talk to ministers in this region, they're much keener to talk about dengue and, of course, the state of the National Referral Hospital than necessarily malaria. So part of our job is to make sure that we have tools like the Leaders Dashboard in Asia or the scorecard in Africa, and make sure that they are visible. At the same time, remind the senior officials, the ministers from the central agencies of the commitments that their leaders have made. It's a very interesting exercise if you look at the East Asia Summit Chairman's statement, for example. There's a whole host of initiatives and recommendations in those summits, most of which are never discussed again. And so the value of those kind of commitments they're only as valuable as the processes and the leadership and the support that we have available to maintain visibility, traction, and monitoring around those goals. So part of, I think, the unique role of APLMA, the Asian Alliance, and ALMA, the African Alliance, is making sure that those tools exist, sure, that they have a mandate that is broadly understood and recognized from heads of government, but critically that gap between meeting once a year and making a commitment and the routine job of allocating budget, monitoring results, managing for results at provincial level as well as central level, and then repeat year on year, has to be kept in the public eye. It has to be raised up the political agenda of leaders and central agencies and the bureaucrats. And that's a full-time job, essentially maintaining that visibility over the data, engagement with the data, rewarding results. For both Alma and ourselves, that is our bread and butter, essentially.
Right. And that in itself is kind of a new form of advocacy, filling that gap or making sure that that gap isn't too wide.
That's right, and it's essential. The HIV community were incredibly unprecedented in their success in terms of advocacy, but it's a very different beast. And the kind of constituencies that we're working with in malaria, by definition, really don't have a voice and have really struggled to build visibility around this disease in a way that other disease priorities have found more straightforward. In this region, of course, it gets even more complicated because, of course, we are all pulling in the same direction around universal health coverage. And I see certainly malaria for us an entry point into a discussion about health for the rural poor and for neglected communities, some of the most poor and vulnerable communities in our region. And so making those links between malaria, UHC and the commitments that leaders have made across that whole agenda is another central part of our work.
Right. So we're going back to the general theme of leadership. I'm wondering what other forms of malaria leadership you're seeing in your region. Are there new models of leadership emerging apart from what we're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, interestingly, the World Malaria Congress program came out today, and I've been looking through that. And I think, in fact, the Congress really exemplifies the emerging leadership themes that we're seeing globally and certainly in Asia Pacific. The academic community, I think, is vocal like never before. The crisis of drug-resistant malaria in the Mekong has really encouraged academics to raise their voice around this global threat. The Malaria Policy Advisory Committee, which of course is the who's who of global leaders in thought leadership in malaria, is increasingly active, doing increasingly critical work to make sure that we have clear evidence-based policy guidance coming out of the World Health Organization. Civil society groups are becoming increasingly organized. If you look at the regional artemisinin initiative in the Greater Mekong sub-region, the coalition of civil society now has a formal secretariat under a managing contractor. They're meeting just next week to discuss their advocacy priorities for the next 2 years. So civil society has always been there, but they're becoming increasingly vocal. And I think this is a critical part of the puzzle, because as we move towards elimination and towards the last mile, it's non-governmental, non-state actors that are the critical service providers. And so civil society voice in increasing awareness of how important that role is will be critical. So academia, central agencies, the regional development banks are getting involved in a way that they had never done so before. So I think it's a really exciting time, essentially.
Right. One of the rationales for the Malaria Congress is bringing together these different sectors and different players. At a more general level, outside the context of the conference, who do you think has got that kind of convening power? Who's going to lead in that area of bringing these different sectors together?
Well, I think the Congress has firstly taken us in a huge stride forward in acknowledging the need for a regular convening of the entire community. So this is the inaugural Congress, and whilst everyone is rightly skeptical of the time, transaction cost and money involved in convening a meeting like this, I think the fact that there has not been a single forum for this community to meet and convene before has been a huge problem. The Congress have made real efforts to be as inclusive as possible, and I think you can see that across the agenda. All interest groups, all communities, areas of expertise are included, which is fantastic. Where will that leadership go going forward? And I think that is a key question in my mind. How can we make sure that this becomes an ongoing endeavor with a secretariat that is seen by the community as being legitimate and speaking, with the voice of the community, of the malaria community and allied interests and expertise? And how can we link it to the policy processes that are ongoing? For example, the groundbreaking CHOGM commitment, the Commonwealth Heads of Government commitment that we had just a few weeks ago. There needs to be a regular forum by which all of the constituents that are going to be required to solve that problem, to halve the malaria burden in just a few years, there needs to be a forum by which all of those are convened. And you could say the same about the Asian 2030 goal and the African goals under the SDGs and under their own 2030 agreement with the African Union. So I think there's never been a greater need for these communities to convene together. The challenge is doing it in a way that gets a genuine impact-focused dialogue going. And the steering committee of the Congress, of which I'm a member, but really under the leadership of Helen Evans, Brendan Crabb, Alan Cowman and others, they have worked incredibly hard trying to make sure that the Congress is really inclusive, that it is fully participatory, and that we get a really clear statement out of the end of it, and hopefully an agreement to have some ongoing secretariat so this doesn't become a one-off affair.
All right, great. You each represent very different regions of the world, Africa and Asia Pacific, where malaria manifests itself very differently in those two settings, two places. When it comes to malaria, what do you think are the most important types of collaboration between those two regions, and how can we help that to happen?
It's a really good question, and there's no single answer. In fact, we both work in very, very diverse regions, and you'll see from the E8 countries that are very forward-leaning on elimination in sub-Saharan Africa to other countries like Nigeria, where they still have a long way to go. Each country has its own circumstances and requires its own type of leadership. You know, a decentralized setting such as Nigeria, with very different epidemiological contexts, etc., different financing contexts, requires a completely different approach from somewhere like Botswana, for example. And again, in our region, we see a huge diversity between Papua New Guinea to Afghanistan and all the countries in between. So there is no single answer. But I think if we've learned anything, it's that these kind of multi-sectoral collaborations are absolutely critical. And it is very important to try and separate what needs to be done regionally from what has to be done at country level. You know, if you try and provide technical support regionally or even do advocacy regionally, it can be an extremely expensive, transaction-heavy enterprise for very little visibility at country level. So certainly for APLMA, we're increasingly focusing on those countries that we think require the most support. And we are increasingly trying to develop bespoke approaches for each of those countries, recognizing that at a regional level, we need leader level commitment, mandate, regional level tracking. We need to create a sense of competition and a sense of reward for those countries that are tracking really positively towards elimination, but then also make sure that that is balanced with country support, really good technical support, south-to-south cooperation, and that's where APMEN comes in, the Asian Pacific Malaria Elimination Network. This south-to-south peer support that APMEN is able to provide, combined with the kind of leadership level and central agency and financing engagement that APLMA can provide, I think it's a really nice two sides of a coin, if you like. And the job that both APMEN and APLMA have is in crowding in support from this broader constituency of academia, civil society and others. I think only when we've got all of that working together will we see the kind of package of support that we need to eliminate in this region, certainly.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And just to finish with a very general question, we all know that, you know, the latest World Malaria Report was, showed that progress against malaria is stalling. Does that leave you feeling that we're at a kind of a vulnerable or an optimistic point in time in relation to malaria? And where are you on that scale?
Well, you know, I think the whole global community are concerned, and particularly if you just look at the human cost of the current epidemiology across the world, when you see the number of child deaths, you know, as a father myself, I, you know, am very motivated, but also find it very sobering when you see the global burden that we're still suffering with globally. In this region, we've seen more positive news. We've not seen the kind of regression that we've seen in much of sub-Saharan Africa, with a few exceptions, but generally the picture in this region is much more positive. But this is a truly global effort, and I like to think that the kind of success that we've had in this region with Sri Lanka, now with Malaysia, with China, having no indigenous cases last year for the first time, I hope we can create a sense of momentum and make it clear that leadership is rewarded. You know, Sri Lanka has had a huge amount of positive press, publicity, impact on the tourism sector, etc., from their success in achieving elimination. And I hope that this kind of new global collaboration, particularly with Royal Bank Malaria now refreshed, we can really create this drumbeat and this sense of momentum where when we do have good news stories, where we do see wins, they help to encourage and support the leadership of those working in much more difficult environments. I'm thinking DRC, Nigeria, for example, and support their leadership and make this a truly global collaboration.
Well, thank you very much, and look forward to hearing more from you at the Malaria Congress at the start of July. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Yeah, very much looking forward to it. Thanks, Tim.